Christmas Eve is here. Have you opened your presents yet? And if you have opened them, are you the type of people who carefully fold each piece of wrapping paper and save it for next year, or save the bow, put them in a package? Or are you more like my family, where after you open the presents, it is like an explosion of Christmas has happened right there in the living room? When my family opens presents, there are bits of paper and bows and tissue paper all over the place. It is a giant mess. And I have a confession in that this mess, it sort of makes me anxious each year to sit in the midst of all of that. I long to kind of pick up and clean and move on to the next phase, to get things cleaned up and tidy. But I have learned that that's exactly in the mess where love and Christmas is most real. In the mess, when the presents are opened, it's not about the presents, but love shows up in the thought behind the gift, in the enjoyment and delight of someone who's received something they've been just dying to have. And before you know it, someone has given a bow to one of the cats to bat around on the floor, or someone else has stuck a bow on top of the dog's head, and we all laugh. And in the mess, in that moment, we don't need to rush to the next thing, because in the mess is where love is most real on Christmas Eve, at least for my family. But there is a truth to this, that love, God shows up so often in the messiness of life, right in the middle of the mess. And so it goes that on the very first Christmas when Jesus was born, the world was a mess. The world for Mary and Joseph was a mess. It was in the midst of a census. The census was commanded by the Roman Empire, by the authorities, for the sake of taxation. The large percentage, 80 to 90% of people living in that region under Roman oppression and authority, 80 to 90% were poor and impoverished. And the only 1 to 2% held the wealth and held the power, because literally political power was purchased back in those days. You had to fund your own campaign to get into office. And so the vast majority of people were poor and dominated by the whims of the very few wealthy. And the whims of the wealthy decided that there would be a census, and that people the likes of Mary and Joseph, poor as they are, pregnant as Mary was, well, they had to travel and be on the move so that they could be counted and they could be taxed. And those taxed dollars would go to fund to expand and the military conquests and the expansion of the Roman Empire. So the world was truly a mess for Mary and Joseph and their kind, their communities on that very first Christmas. But for Mary and Joseph, the mess of life went beyond just their political situation, their worldly situation. The mess was very personal for them. You see, Mary was pregnant and not married, and that kind of thing would have been the subject of scandal and gossip, and long remembered in their tiny village of Nazareth as Mary, the one who had committed this sort of adultery. The memories were long and the gossipers were many. And Joseph determined that he, after visiting an angel and hearing a message from God, he would indeed stick by Mary's side and he would get married to her. And so in that way, he too absorbed the scandal and the gossip and the shame that is thrown upon them by their community. And so their personal lives were a mess. And as they traveled and arrived at Bethlehem, they arrived at a family home and received traditional Middle Eastern hospitality. And so traditionally, in many of our children's programs and in popular culture, we hear about an innkeeper who says there's no room in the inn. But actually, as time has gone on and scholars have learned more about what was historically accurate, where Mary and Joseph arrived was not at a hotel, but at a family home. They were traveling to their family hometown, Bethlehem, the city of David, where Joseph's line had come from. And so they sought to stay at the family home. And these homes were one-room peasant homes, not very large. There would sometimes be a guest room above the main structure. So this guest room, in Mary and Joseph's case, that guest room was full. So they had to stay in the main space with this crowded family. Everyone had descended on this town to be counted for the census. So a very crowded one-room house. And in this one-room house, there was a section with a manger, and the animals were brought inside at night. So that's where Jesus was born, in the part of the house with the animals. And there was such a crowded place, there was no place to lay him but the manger, the trough that held the food for the animals. And so Jesus arrived not in a fancy hotel, not in a pristine Hallmark card situation of Christmas Eve. Jesus arrived right there in a crowded mess. The world was a mess. Mary and Joseph's life was a mess. And literally, the crowded home they were in was likely a mess. And into that mess, Jesus, the light of the world, was born. The angels declared to the shepherds that this child was born, this brand new child, to create a brand new reality, to declare that it is not the Roman Empire and the emperor's authority that determines reality. It is this brand new baby king who is the king of love, who determines our reality. Jesus comes into the world and flips the world upside down, but he doesn't wait until life gets better or the census is over or political peace has been earned or achieved. Jesus arrives right there in the middle of the mess to declare peace and hope and goodwill among all people, right there in the mess. And isn't that true for you and me too? So often we think we need to get ourselves cleaned up and pristine and fix up our lives, and then God will come to us, or we'll get ourselves ready for God to arrive in our lives. But that's not true. We don't need to clean up ourselves. Jesus arrives right in the middle of our messy lives and stays with us our whole lives long. Jesus, Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. And Jesus is God with us even in the mess and the messiness of life. And often it's in the mess where we see love most real and most present, just like on that messy Christmas Eve I described with my own family. But even our beloved Christmas carol we sing at the end of worship each Christmas Eve, Silent Night, even that was created in a mess. In the year 1818, in a tiny Australian village, Oberndorf, Austria village, the Oberndorf, Austria, there was a priest, Joseph Moore, who was young, only 26 years old, and he was responsible for Christmas Eve at his church, which happened to be called St. Nicholas Church. And don't you know, the organ broke. How do you have Christmas Eve worship in that time and place with no organ? And so he had to think quickly on his feet. It was Christmas Eve after all, and he had composed a poem called Silent Night, Holy Night. So he thought he would go to his friend, Franz Gruber, in a neighboring town, which he did, and he gave him the poem and said, "Can you set this to music today?" Which he did, and the two of them then performed for the very first time in 1818 in Austria, in the tiny village of Oberndorf. They performed Silent Night with no organ, only guitar. And so even in the messiness of that Christmas Eve in Austria, even in the messiness of our own Christmas Eves, even in the messiness of that very first Christmas Eve, God shows up with love to declare that God, the light of the world, Jesus, the light of the world, comes into our world, and there is nothing that will overcome it. Thanks be to God. Amen.